Hi, this is Rabbi Ben Sion Kravitz with Jews For Judaism, located here in Los Angeles. I'd like to speak to you today about a verse from the book of Bereshit, the book of Genesis, chapter 1, verse 27. It's a often misunderstood and misinterpreted verse. The verse says that God said, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness. Vayomer Elokim nase adam b'tzalmenu k'demusenu." And oftentimes Christian missionaries quote this because of the fact that it says, "Let us make man in our image and our likeness," using the plural form. And they want to interpret this to mean that God is a plurality. But no verse in the Bible can be read to the exclusion of the rest of the Bible. And there are other verses that shed light on this passage. For example, there is a concept in biblical Hebrew called the majestic plural, where kings, as God is the King of kings, speak in the royal plurality. For example, Daniel, who was a great leader, he said in Daniel chapter 2, verse 36, "Such was the dream, and we will now tell the king its meaning." Notice that Daniel doesn't say, "I will tell the king." He says, "we." He speaks in this majestic plural. But that's not the only interpretation here, that this is God speaking in the majestic plural. I think there's a much deeper lesson that teaches us a lesson in life. And we have to understand that God is not a plurality because there are so many other passages that teach that. For example, Deuteronomy chapter 4, verse 25 says, "Ato haresu ladas ki Hashem hu ha'elokim ein od." You should know this day that the Lord your God exists and there's nothing else besides him. Ein od milvado means there's nothing else besides God. So if there's nothing else besides God, to talk about plurality of God doesn't make sense. Also, in Isaiah chapter 44, verse 6, it says, "Ko amar Hashem, melech Yisrael, v'goalo Hashem tzivakot, ani rishon v'ani acharon, umibalodai ein Elokim." This verse says that the Lord teaches us that God is the first, God is the last, and there is nothing else besides God. This means that God transcends all the limitations of time and space. So therefore, something that transcends time and space can't be divided into parts. There is no plurality. That's why the fundamental prayer of the Jewish people is, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one." That doesn't mean that there's just one God. The Lord is one. There's a oneness. Everything that exists in the world that appears to be separate from God is merely one of God's creations. And it does not have an independent existence unless God's creating it. So why did God choose here, in this particular verse in Genesis, to use the plural and say, "Let us make God in our image"? Well, we see that the process of creation, throughout the book of Genesis, God speaks the creation into being. God said, "Let there be light." God said the following. For example, in Genesis 1, verse 11, it says, "And God said, let the earth sprout vegetation." So metaphorically, we have God speaking to the earth, which he already created, and commanding the earth to be a partner in the creation and let the earth sprout vegetation. We also see, as we move through the book of Genesis, chapter 1, verse 20, it says, "And God said, let the water bring forth and swarm with living creatures." So here we have God speaking to the water, engaging it to participate in the creation, and the water brings forth these creatures. We continue and go further. Genesis 1:24, God said, "Let the earth bring forth every kind of living creature." Once again, God speaks and causes and engages the world into being a partner in creating something. The only case where it doesn't say a similar thing like that is in the creation of man. It doesn't say, "Let the earth bring forth man? Because we know that man was created from the earth. That's why it says, and God formed man from the dust of the earth, and he blew into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living being. Interestingly, when it says here, Vayitzer Hashem Elokim es ha'adam afer min ha'adama, he made him from the earth. The word Adama is similar to the word for the name of the first man. Adam was called Adam. Hebrew is Adam. Adam comes from this word Adama. He's named after what he's created from. The partnership that God had here is he utilized the earth to create the physical body of the first man, Adam, known as Adam. And then God became the additional partner that he blew the soul into the body that he had created from the earth. So this is why it says, let us make man in our image. God says to make man in the plural, because mankind, Adam, is in the image of God, that it has a spiritual soul, and it's also in the image of the earth that it has a physical body. This is why God chose in this particular verse to use the plural. Unlike the previous verses where God involved and he called forth creations from the water and from the ground, here he actually formed the man's body and then put the soul into it. And it's only with a human being that it uses this word, neshama, that the person has this spiritual entity of a spiritual soul. And we see also that in Ecclesiastes chapter 12, verse 7, a very famous verse, that it says when a person dies, that the dust returns to the ground from which it came, and the soul returns back to God who gave it to the person. So human beings are a combination of both a physical existence and a spiritual existence. And that is why, in the same way that God is speaking to the creation in making everything else, he speaks here to the physical earth, the Adamah, and he creates Adam and he puts the soul into it. That's why he uses the plural. I think there's also a very, very important lesson here also when we talk about that God made man in his image. Sometimes people start hating and disliking other people because they don't look like them or they don't act like them. We have to remember that God didn't make mankind in our image. We get angry at other people when they're not like us. But when we recognize that God made man in his image, that every human being was created in a unique way by God, then we can learn to respect one another.